Dawn of the space race, Sputnik, shocks the world, space, the final frontier. But in 1957 it was also the backdrop for a new kind of rivalry, the space race. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, it wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was a shot across the bow of the United States. Imagine the surprise, the disbelief, as a metal sphere, no bigger than a beach ball, began circling our planet. It emitted a simple radio beep, but to American ears it sounded an alarm. The Soviets had beaten them to space. But Sputnik represented something far more ominous than just losing a competition. It hinted at the Soviet Union's growing technological prowess, particularly in rocketry. If they could launch a satellite into orbit, could they also launch a nuclear warhead at the United States? The launch of Sputnik ignited a firestorm of fear and anxiety in the American psyche. The missile gap became a common phrase, reflecting the growing concern that the Soviets had surpassed the US in missile technology. President Eisenhower, a seasoned military strategist, knew he had to act decisively. He called for a meeting of NATO allies. A plan was hatched to counter the Soviet threat. The United States, in a move that would have profound consequences, decided to deploy Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. These were medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of striking Moscow in a matter of minutes. The game of nuclear chess had begun. While the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear standoff, a revolution was brewing just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Fidel Castro, a charismatic revolutionary, overthrew the Batista regime and established a communist state in Cuba. This was a major victory for the Soviet Union in the Cold War. A communist ally in the Western Hemisphere right on America's doorstep was a strategic prize. The US viewed Castro's Cuba with suspicion and hostility. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous attempt to overthrow Castro's regime using Cuban exiles, only served to strengthen the bond between Cuba and the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a colossal failure for the United States. In April 1961, a force of Cuban exiles, trained and funded by the CIA, landed on the shores of Cuba. They expected a popular uprising against Castro. They were met with fierce resistance. Castro's forces, well-equipped and prepared, crushed the invasion within 72 hours. The Bay of Pigs was a humiliating defeat for President Kennedy and cemented his resolve to remove Castro from power. It also pushed Cuba further into the arms of the Soviet Union, setting the stage for a confrontation that would push the world to the brink. Section 5. A discovery that shook the world: Soviet missiles in Cuba. In October 1962, an American U-2 spy plane, soaring high above the island of Cuba, captured photographs that sent shockwaves through the U.S. intelligence community. There, in the Cuban countryside, were the unmistakable outlines of Soviet SS-4 nuclear missile sites under construction. The implications were chilling. These were not short-range tactical weapons but medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of reaching targets across the continental United States. Washington, D.C., New York City, even Chicago, all were within range. The world held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when the world came closest to nuclear war, had begun. Section 6. 13 minutes to Armageddon, the world holds its breath. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba triggered a chain reaction in the White House. President Kennedy convened a group of his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. They faced an unprecedented crisis: nuclear weapons, just 90 miles from American shores, controlled by a hostile power. The SS-4 missiles, once operational, could reach their targets in the U.S. within 13 minutes. 13 minutes, that's less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee, to read a newspaper article, to say goodbye to loved ones. The weight of responsibility was immense. One wrong move, one miscalculation, could trigger a nuclear holocaust that would engulf the entire world. The fate of humanity hung precariously in the balance. Section 7. Avoiding the abyss, a tense standoff and secret negotiations. As the world watched with bated breath, President Kennedy addressed the nation. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, a blockade in all but name, to prevent further Soviet shipments of offensive military equipment. The tension was palpable. Soviet ships, some carrying military cargo, steamed towards Cuba. U.S. Navy ships waited, prepared to intercept them. The world held its breath, hoping against hope that cooler heads would prevail. Behind the scenes, however, a different kind of diplomacy was taking place. Secret negotiations, fraught with tension and distrust, were underway between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Section 8. The legacy of a near miss. Lessons from the brink. After days that felt like an eternity, the crisis reached its climax. Premier Khrushchev, in a message that offered a glimmer of hope, agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. In return, the US made a public pledge not to invade Cuba. Secretly, the US also agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world had ever come to nuclear annihilation, was over. The crisis had a profound impact on both superpowers. It led to the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. It also highlighted the need for arms control and de-escalation of tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the importance of diplomacy in a world armed with nuclear weapons. It is a lesson we must never forget.